They've not yet put in place an effective counterattack on the ground. There have been some signs that they're now digging trenches and fortifications, but those are a long way back from where the front is. So they might be expecting that they're going to lose more territory before they get on it.
Ukraine says their forces are continuing to advance into Russian territory, as well as claim to have captured 100 prisoners of war in the border region. On the other hand, we're hearing from Russian officials who are saying nearly 200,000 people have been evacuated following the incursion from last week. We're now 10 days into this incursion. What's been your analysis of it so far?
So I think, there's an awful lot of this that is sort of slightly obscured to us or that we don't fully know. And I think the Ukrainians have done quite a good job of maintaining their operational security, that they're more disciplined on social media, particularly than they have been in the past. And so a lot of this is sort of slightly inference and educated guesswork, as well as some, good journalism from people who have gone to the area and are embedded with them. I think the main headline that I would draw at this point is that this looks slightly more expansive and ambitious in terms of what they're trying to achieve than maybe we first thought. When the initial operation started, I speculated a range of different potential objectives. And that ranged from the sort of the tactical in terms of pressuring Russian forces further across in Kharkiv and spotting opportunity and exploiting it, up to kind of big picture, if you like, the kind of the propaganda battle and reversing the narrative. And it's worth thinking that the past 6 months have largely seen the Ukrainians on the defensive and the Russians grinding forward. What the Ukrainians have been a bit more explicit about in the past 24, 48 hours is that to say that they don't intend to, if you like, seize part of Russia in terms of, if you like, annex it, but that they are making the point that they want to put pressure on Putin and might be thinking longer term. And I think that brings with it both some opportunities and some significant risks. The opportunity is that this really does put the Russians on the back foot to a degree, and they are seizing the initiative in Ukraine, as in the Ukrainians are seizing the initiative. The challenge is that Putin has proven to be incredibly resistant to setbacks or changing his mind. He's 2 years into what was meant to be a short, sharp operation. His forces have suffered 500,000 casualties, that's dead and injured, and he doesn't show any sign of wanting to sort of slow down or have a second thought. So I think it's possibly optimistic that this will radically change his mindset at the moment.
It's interesting that you say that, because we've heard reports that Putin's response to this incursion has been quite shaky. What would you say that you've made of his response to it so far?
Well, the Russian response across the board has not been very impressive. It's not been well coordinated. It's not been rapid. At the start of the week, it looked as if they had maybe stemmed the Ukrainian advances. Well, the Ukrainians have advanced further since then. So actually, they've not yet put in place an effective counterattack on the ground. There have been some signs that they're now digging trenches and fortifications, but those are a long way back from where the front is. So they might be expecting that they're going to lose more territory before they get on it. Putin can probably try and evade some of the responsibility for that through the classic blame game. This seems to be as a result of a thinly defended area, some complacency. It's not large conventional forces defending it. And so, the blame game of who's responsible for this terrible oversight. But now that he has talked about appointing somebody to lead the response, he is more closely associating himself with it. And therefore, there is a higher degree of risk if there's not a rapid reversal enforced through Russian, military power. Although, again, this whole operation is obviously his thing, and he has not come under serious domestic political pressure thus far. So there are probably limits on that.
And talking about domestic political pressure, we're hearing how news of this incursion is spreading across Russian citizens. Their awareness of it is growing. What impact do you think that would have on their perception of Putin and also his war in Ukraine?
So at the moment, it might be limited because, as I said, what will happen is you can blame corruption in the system, the apparatchiks, the other people, the local commanders. There will inevitably be some blowback over time, but again, the Russian system's proven quite good at suppressing that. Conversely, it is worth saying the Ukrainians might have a much better insight into internal Russian dynamics than somebody sitting 1,000 miles away in London, and a better appreciation of where those cracks in the system are. And of course, in many respects, authoritarian governments look very strong right up until the point that they fracture, and you discover that they were brittle beneath the surface. So I think there are people much better than me at the sort of the Kremlinology of really reading what's going on in the Russian system. What is the case is that we're already seeing a broader awareness and some surprise at the extent to which another country has invaded Russia, and that's the first time it's happened since the Second World War, and there is some shock in the system at that. What it hasn't yet had is the effect of changing what the situation in the East. So is we're sort of jumping from the high political back down to the tactical, and that we should know the Russians are still advancing out of the Donbass towards places like Savill and Pokrovsk. And indeed, some of the Ukrainian forces who are in this incursion have been telling people they've actually been pulled from that part of the front. So the Russians are still in the parts of the front line where they've had these advantages, using them to grind forward. It is possible that this operation is actually done in the knowledge that the Ukrainians are going to cede more territory in the east. And therefore, it is an attempt to preempt the blow to morale that would cause by actually showing they can still go on the front foot. In other words, if they think it's inevitable they're going to have to pull back, it's better to show now that they can still maneuver, still attack, still have an impact. That will matter considerably for Ukrainian morale, but it's also a message to international backers in the US, in Europe. We're still in this fight. And I think there's a question of is that trade-off worth it? We might need to come back to this in weeks or months to really understand the impact.
The big question here is, how long do we think that Ukraine can hold this incursion in Kursk? What do you think of that?
So I would have said previously, I think it would be risky to try and hold it for months or in the face of a determined Russian counterattack. Because what this does is they've had to move up forces from across the front line. It lengthens that front line, and the Russians already have a people and equipment advantage. And it puts Ukrainian forces in a more exposed position in Russia, in range of potentially more counterattacking forces and Russian air power, jets and helicopters. And that looks risky. They've taken some of their better mechanized, fast-moving units and put them into this assault. They might have taken some air defences with them, and they've started using drones to actually attack helicopters. So they track them, and when they stop to hover, they hit them with an FPV drone, first-person view. At the same time, their drone campaign, which has already been underway, has been hitting Russian air bases harder. And they need to do that because those are the bases from which the Russians are launching attacks against Kharkiv. But it also benefits the incursion force. So it looks like the Ukrainians think they might be able to sustain this for a bit longer. I do still think that looks risky because they'll have to resupply, they'll have to move that in on the ground. They're going to come under a more intense counterattack at some point, and they don't want these forces to be chewed up and lost and have to be pulled back and re-equipped and more recruiting done. So we're once again in this sort of slightly guessing game of how much cost are they prepared to bear to keep this force on Russian territory, to impose that dilemma on the Russians. And again, to a certain degree, the Ukrainians have called this right in terms of the vulnerability in the lines. They could have better insight into the speed at which the Russians could respond than all of us external observers. But I still think it involves taking a bit of a gamble with precious resources that they don't want to lose.
Mm. So, all in all, on reflection, in terms of looking at morale for Ukraine, but then also this redeployment of resources, soldiers, etc., would you say that this was a risk that Zelensky should have taken? Do you think that it's paying off?
I don't know if it's for me to sort of tell the Ukrainians whether they should have done this, particularly not as is actually, as I say, it's difficult to make a judgment now because we don't know the full cost. But at the moment, it certainly looks like it's paying off in two key respects. One, it's absolutely changing the overall narrative of Russian advance, Ukrainian retreat, and, if you like, concern over the ability of the Ukrainian military to seize the initiative. And two, it definitely looks like, at least in the north, Ukrainian morale and, if you like, the domestic political and kind of societal narrative is more positive. You can see from the reporting there that they are basically pumped up, that they are on the move and they are taking the fight to the Russians. I think there are some things to look out for in the long term, not just what we've talked about in terms of the cost, in terms of what do they lose, what casualties do they suffer, but there is potential leverage here with international partners, both in terms of big picture support, US election coming up. Also, I would expect, they've already hinted at this, that the pressure to be coming on in terms of use of internationally supplied weapons, and really we mean the longer range stuff. They're already using Western supplied armoured vehicles, tanks in this assault, close-in artillery, like that doesn't appear to be an issue. And then I think there will be a tactical question of, does this change the picture in the north of Ukraine and essentially compel the Russians to pull back from Kharkiv? And I think if they can do that, achieve that success without taking significant losses amongst their forces, then they will have both achieved tactical battlefield benefit and probably the sort of the strategic international support benefit that means that they could call this a success. But I think we are genuinely a long way from really being able to make that determination.
Finally, Zelensky, he called on Britain to allow for the use of long-range missiles to strike deep inside Russian territories to aid this Kursk incursion. Do we see any movement, any updates on Britain's response to this?
It doesn't look like it on the basis of the statements that have been made in the past 24 hours, which is essentially the vast majority of material that's been provided by the UK doesn't have a restriction on it. The front line happens to have moved over the border. Those armoured vehicles, artillery, short-range weapons are effectively all good to be used, because it'd be odd to basically draw an invisible force field along the border and say they can't cross it. The way that they described saying there's been no change suggests that Storm Shadow still has some limitations on it. But I wouldn't be surprised if there's a discussion happening behind the scenes with the Ukrainians asking us and the Americans to reconsider on ATACMS. It's worth noting there's a relatively limited target set where those are useful. The Ukrainians already have much longer reach with their own drone program, and that's what they've been using this week, again, apparently successfully. But there is a set of targets, so either hardened targets, where Storm Shadow and Scout would be useful because they penetrate bunkers and protection. And the same for one variant of the ATACMS warhead. And then secondly, there is the question of using the cluster variant of ATACMS to hit aircraft and helicopters that might be out in the open. These aircraft that use the glide bombs, they're very difficult to intercept the glide bombs once they've been launched. But if you can shoot down the jet before it launches, or better yet, catch it on the ground, that is the best means of stopping those air attacks. And so a cluster variant being fired over the border into Russia against those targets, that's where that would be useful. I think we need to be cautious about the idea that those weapons would change the course of the war, but this is where they'd really complement the drone attacks and the incursion and help defend the area north of Kharkiv.